I think that focusing on sustainability is a challenge, because most folks in the trades see it as a luxury, something that they have to like work to get to, and in order to get there they need to like somehow be more stable or something. And I'm just like, gosh, that sounds like that sounds like an unaccomplishable feat for most.
This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Welcome to the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. This is your host, Neil Collins. It is a show that is supported by our work at Latitude Realty. In it, we explore our natural and built environments and how they can be used as a force for good. The show sets out to inspire impactful ideas, meaningful change, human wellness, and ecological restoration through interviews and easy-to-digest conversations. Our guests range from industry leaders to iconoclasts, from both well-known figures to everyday people leading extraordinary lives. This is a show for people looking for education and inspiration on how real estate can be done differently. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I have been really looking forward to this conversation with Adam Sgrenci of the Center for Infrastructure and Society. He is joining us out of Palo Alto in the San Jose area. Adam, Happy New Year to you.
Yeah, Neil, thank you. And Happy New Year. What a day to be together. The last day of 2020.
So we're recording this on the eve of 2021. I think we're all looking forward to really seeing where we're going to go as a future and into a new year, putting 2020 behind us. But Adam, let's actually start with that. How has your year been? And where are you, and what's your background, and how have you fared 2020?
Yeah, that's the big question, and it's a really good question to ask. 2020 for me has been, considering, really good. It's been really good. We've been lucky as a family. The business has had time to really form and emerge since folks are being a little bit more reflective, this year. And the ups and downs that have come along the way haven't been easy, because they have been there. But I think just being in this state of reflection and openness and thoughtfulness has brought me to December 31st, and looking back on what I think has been a pretty good year, actually.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear that. And the reason why we're recording this and you're on the podcast is we've had a conversation before, and I know that you're going through a lot of really deep reflections on what regeneration is and how to apply it into the built environment. And you're in the construction side of the industry, but I love to back up. And I told you this before we were recording, and I tell it to every single podcast guest. It's so hard to just jump into, hey, what is your work about? But where do you come from? Where'd you grow up?
So I'm from Jersey, born in New Jersey. Went to, and jumped over the Delaware River into the Northeast Philadelphia area, and spent my childhood and adolescence out there on the East Coast. Did my undergrad studies in Central Pennsylvania, and it wasn't until 2003 that I moved out to the West Coast. So, when I think about where I come from and my identity and all that stuff, grew up in that part of the country. So a lot of my perspective on even the construction workforce, society, some worldviews, a lot of that has, was born there and still continues to inform my worldview today.
I mean, when I think of New Jersey, I've never been there, but I think like suburb of New York City, and I think a lot of concrete, just a lot of building. And I don't think a lot of natural space. What did you grow up connected to nature, or was it more city life?
Yeah, great question. So New Jersey's the Garden State, which some people know because they saw the movie.
I
But
thought that
if you
was just
haven't
an
seen the movie,
ironic title.
yeah, a lot of industrial sort of, activity. My father is an electrician, and when we were growing up in Jersey in the Philly area, he had worked on like brownfield projects. And I remember late '90s, mid '90s, what is a brownfield, and what is that about? And so it wasn't until much later in life when I understood a little bit more about what that is. But there's a lot of industrial, especially when you drive, from New Jersey to New York, you're just passing all kinds of industrial property. And so you don't get the sense of the Garden State where I grew up. But my family, they were also very outdoorsy, outdoors men, I guess, they're into hunting and fishing and all that. And back in the 50s and 60s, when they were all growing up, like my parents and uncles and aunts, it was a very green place. And so there's a deep connection in my family to just connecting with nature. But as I grew up, you find yourself surrounded in more of a suburban, block grid of culture. But it wasn't hard to step outside of that and get into nature. I have great memories of the Delaware River, which is what sort of divides where I was born and where I ultimately ended up growing up. I spent a lot of time in the Delaware River. In fact, I was in a Regenesis group like meeting only a couple weeks ago, and they started out their icebreaker with the group. The question was, think of your favorite place and tell the person that we're going to put you in the breakout group with. And so my favorite place is on the Delaware River. There's this like concrete little jetty that walks out almost into the middle of the river, and Lambertville and New Hope and these cute little towns are very nearby. And that's like my favorite place. You have to take this walking trail from a road. It takes about 20 minutes. You get to the jetty, you walk out, you can fish off the jetty, you can swim off the jetty. You can just sit on the jetty, you can watch people go by in canoes. So yeah, there was always a deep connection there for me. And then when I went off to undergrad in central Pennsylvania, I went to Bucknell, which is just a small liberal arts school out in the middle of a rural countryside. I mean, we would go camping before class. We wouldn't even sleep in a tent. We'd roll up the sleeping bag, hop in the Jeep and drive to class. So there was always a deep connection to nature. I always envisioned I'd be a tree farmer because so something my dad and I used to do together is dig out Christmas trees from a farm and bring them to our house for Christmas. And then we would plant them in our backyard. And we ended up with 30 Christmas trees in our backyard after a lifetime of growing up. The tree farmer thing didn't happen yet, but definitely starting to connect more and more to farming and trees in my 40s. So
I'm
back here again.
I love where you went with that, because maybe this is the PSA that I want to have for everybody, is that like, if you ask people where their favorite memories are growing up, it's typically going to be connected with nature. And nature doesn't just protect itself. And you and I are both in the real estate industry, where the concept of a bundle of property rights, we hold that very tightly in the US. And we've commoditized land to where it's like, hey, we just need to go grab it. And we can do anything that we want with it if it pertains to our zoning laws. But nature doesn't protect itself, certainly. And if we want to have a future and future generations that are really rooted in place and connection to place. They're not connected to the apartment building that they grew up in, or even the HOA pool. They're connected with like, hey, wow, I went camping with my dad, or we went out and we cut down or we got a Christmas tree and planted it in the backyard. Like those are truly generative ideas and upbringings that can catalyze the work that you're doing today and the work that I'm doing, certainly. And so I'm curious, how did you go from there? You graduated. Now you're in the construction side of the industry. Bring us up to speed on what happened in the last, I know that might be a couple decades now, but how did you get to the point where you started Center for Infrastructure and Society?
Okay. So after school, so this was, I graduated college, in 2001. And I went and lived abroad for a year. I was in Chile, wanted to learn Spanish, taught English and did that kind of adventure, had that experience. I moved back to New York now, roughly a year and a half later, and I was in social work. What I'd studied in school was local economic development policy. I had two majors, geology and economics. And the reason I chose those two was I was looking to understand the world. So there's the physical aspect and there was an economic aspect. That at the time was my yin yang of my life, right? Understanding those two and how they work together. So it led me to a social work position, working for an organization that was responsible for overseeing like disaster relief from 9/11. And so because I just left Chile, I was, the bilingual case manager, let's say, for undocumented workers that had been affected by the event. And so I felt like this was the right job for me at the time. But I quickly also saw where the direction of that position was going, being a white male in a position of that much power. We were essentially one of the organizations in charge of the September 11th fund, and the access to those funds and resources was great because I got to understand and navigate that space of social work and ultimately, community development. But it felt really uncomfortable after a while being the gatekeeper in a way of all that money. And so the program ultimately, was, had finished. And I just wanted to move out west. I had always dreamed of learning construction. And I started to see a deep connection between my own worldview, social work, understanding the world of economics and geology and all of these things, but also connecting and just using my hands to build something and connect with a workforce that I felt was, had a lot of power. Growing up in New Jersey, a lot of the unions had been controlled and managed by organized crime, at least when I was growing up, and still it may be that way. But I just felt like, gosh, there's an interesting dynamic going on between black market and or what's called, informal economy, essentially, and all of these other sort of more, let's say, official, just entrepreneurial activities that are impacting the planet. And while I was at school, I also was studying all of these large international construction firms. And, we think of Bechtel and you think of Halliburton and you think of some of these other large companies. And why is it that they list as one of their offerings democracy building? What is the connection between construction and ultimate, whether it's governance or mobility or access to education? And so for me, construction just became this humongous just flow of water that I needed to jump into. And so that's sort of what got me into the industry in 2003. I took a job as an apprentice carpenter. And since 2003 up until 2015 or 16 or so, I just been mostly swinging a hammer and ultimately leading construction companies, and helping construction companies treat their workforce better, with new approaches at workforce development. So I guess to take you all over that little wild web I just weaved, it really has always been local economic development policy, social work. But through those lenses, I was using the medium of the construction industry to just explore and grow as a person.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't call it a wild web, because to me it's like a funnel down into even really understanding the name of your company, the Center for Infrastructure and Society, where I had to think about this before we started to record of like, what is he getting at with infrastructure and society? And I wanted to see where that was going. And now it's much more clear to understand infrastructure being not only the buildings itself, but the building blocks for democracy and other areas that you're bringing up. So I'm very curious. I know that this is a bit of a nebulous question for you, because your company is relatively new. But I want to know, like, what was the genesis behind creating the center?
That's a great question. So the last job that I had was working for a prop tech company, a venture-backed prop tech company called Setter. And what Setter was attempting to do was to try and make it easier for homeowners to live in their home by providing a resource, an easy resource, essentially a construction management app, to do anything and everything on your home. And that was interesting to me, because prior to that, I had been working with a company that really cared for homes holistically. They had all the abilities to build and repair and maintain, but they put it together in a really interesting package. And that company is called Home Preservation Services. And so there was a lot of inspiration I got from HPS that took me to Setter. What I recognized at Setter, and I wasn't surprised, but being venture backed, to try and solve a problem, right? It's all about solving a singular problem with a singular solution. We're already kind of limiting ourselves. And so my hope working there was to not only learn and understand the world of venture-backed tech companies, but also to see how venture-backed tech was connecting with the local workforce that they were quite clearly making a connection to. Because as a homeowner to use the service, they were operating as the marketplace to access the local construction workforce, again, on repairs on the home or new buildings or on maintenance or whatever it is. And so my interest was to understand all of that, but then to see how we might be able to co-design some of the solutions with the actual workforce. And you could probably guess, and this is no slight or any kind of saying anything bad about venture-backed tech, but it's just that they're guided, the way that they were guided or what their compass north was, let's say, was not so much focused on the supply side of their business. It was more focused on the demand side. And so while we needed more resources to support the supply side of the business, the local crafts people and trades that were delivering the services, being in a company that had to grow as fast as it did, in order to meet, and we talked about metrics prior to getting on the podcast, right? To meet certain metrics, there really wasn't any space to develop the tools and the support, and let's even say the empowerment of the local workforce to be able to deliver what it is the company was promising to their homeowners. And so I think that was a learning experience for all of them. And that company continues to do well, and they're in their V3 of who they are, or V4 perhaps. But the point is, I was both empowered individually, like by being a part and in that environment of seeing what it takes to create something and put a certain level of metrics sort of in front of you and try and reach those goals, and have design sprints and all of that experience that I didn't learn as a carpenter or even as an operations manager for a construction company, but really focus on the workforce. And so CIS was born out of all of these experiences really since childhood, recognizing that, the way the world works is basically exploit people and planet to quote unquote develop. And we know that there's another approach. There's many other approaches that don't need to extract in order to, let's say, develop or to thrive. And what CIS was very early on was meant to be a network for a new kind of construction workforce development. So we started with like a small network of vocational schools. That was the idea around the world. And I started by attempting to connect, let's say, City Build in San Francisco, which is a union, a union-based workforce development program for all the trades, all the construction trades. I attempted to connect them with a similar institution in Kathmandu, because I was like, okay, so Kathmandu, Nepal, it's in the Himalayas, it's a valley, but it's exposed to lots of seismic activity. Equally so as San Francisco. And so is there something that these two cities can learn from each other? And how would we connect the workforce? Would we connect the schools? And so I pitched a couple ideas to the folks at City Build in SF about sharing some of their coursework with their counterparts in Kathmandu. And so that was a process that was just a great learning experience. But it wasn't, there was other examples, Dhaka and Bangladesh and Amsterdam for being sea level cities, for example, highly dense urban areas, Mexico City, Lagos, Mumbai, because we're one planet, and we all are doing this together. And we have a lot to learn from each other. And I'm definitely not the first person that's ever attempted to link vocational schools together. But I was just doing it on my own terms, and I was doing it through my own networks. I've had the opportunity to live in a bunch of places and meet a lot of people. And so it was really just starting with those personal connections. That's how CIS started. And even today, that focus on construction workforce development remains to be like at the core of what we do.
I'm curious about the application of this in its current form in the projects that you're working on, because you're hitting on a lot of regenerative themes of how do we thrive, and how do we not just look at an extractive method. Construction is a part of the industry that, almost like real estate sales, that is very different from the developer, the designer approach. It's more kind of relegated into just a very different mode of being. And I'm not seeing a lot of people in the construction space that are saying, hey, you know what, this is what we care about. This is how we're going to do it. And this is how we're going to improve. And I love the two-way street of really trying to connect sister cities and really just those different ways of being, because if you travel around, you realize that we're not all that different, and we have a lot to learn both ways, from developing to developed. But like, how do you work in your projects and apply regenerative thinking towards the work that you're doing?
So there's probably the easiest way to talk about what we do is think of it in three sort of maybe separate categories. They're interdependent. of course, and there's plenty of overlap, but just for the purposes of talking about it here, there's an educational element, an advisory element, and a projects element. So within the educational track or element of what we're doing is we are designing construction education coursework for NGOs and schools, high schools. Even I'm envisioning doing it for I have a fourth grader, and a lot of the programs that we talk to are all about educating kids as well as adults on regenerative practice. So that's an easy thing to do. There's also design challenges that we've been a part of that we're incorporating more into our work with young folks, to ask them a question about their own environments, where they live, and asking just the typical design questions. How might we fill in the blank, the home that you live in, the school that you go to, the community that you're in. Did you know that this much energy is being consumed? Or did you know that these practices are being performed, and what would be a better version of that? And so that's a really fun aspect of work, because it's all about ideation, especially when you get to work with young folks. I'm a history teacher on the side at a high school, and so I'm always trying to weave in conversations about construction history into our conversations in class. And that's one element of what we do. On the advisory side, I work with tech companies that are in that prop tech, construction tech space, and they're just trying to connect to the workforce with their product. And so it's a lot of like humanization of how they connect, how they interview. Like there's a talent acquisition company I'm working with. There's an online construction education company. There's a couple like new platforms that are coming up that are just trying to celebrate the trades. And that's something that has not existed. When you mention you're not seeing a lot of regenerative practice in the construction industry, that's a whole discussion we could have. Why? One reason why is because we don't do a lot of celebrating of the work or of that. It's more about, getting on. First of all, if you're lucky enough to be able to work for a really good company where that you're not going to just get fired because the project's over. If you're lucky enough to be a part of that, what is the career path for someone who's come up in the trades? Are you a part of a company that is teaching you, how to use project management software and how to be a real manager? Are you getting good management as a tradesperson? What does your management look like? So those are some of the things that I've done in the past, working with both traditional construction companies on this and with the tech companies who don't really come from a construction background, but are let's say, are nominally there to quote unquote fix construction. There's a lot of companies that have said that is what they're doing. They're fixing the industry. And, it's not, the industry does need a lot of help. But my question has always been, shouldn't we do this together? Shouldn't we collaborate? Those that have been in the industry for their lives and those who are new to the industry, I think that's where the principles of regeneration have really resonated with me, because I'm a new student to these principles that are being are starting to emerge more and more. Though a lot of what their values are at the core have always been a part of my worldview in some way.
Yeah, what you said about venture and the need to scale, and it seems apparent to me that venture-backed companies have the problem-solving approach that they do need to fix something, rather than having the philosophical approach of let's rediscover who we are, especially in construction, where the mechanistic drive of society has siloed it down into you do this, you do this, you do this. And it's very much an individual approach to the trades and the companies. On our end, I'm seeing a loss of skill transfer generationally. like having a good skilled finish carpenter is almost impossible. And there's a loss there that I don't see a lot of people that are picking that up and really saying, hey, I don't need to fix it, I need to promote it. We need to rediscover the essence of that.
Yeah. You're right on board there. I've written a handful of articles on this topic, and one of them was something like, in order to fix construction, we need to look within. Or one of the companies that I do advisory for, my suggestion for their approach, rather than just focus on looking for the influencers in the industry who are producing a certain kind of content, go directly to the construction companies, because the construction companies have this volumes and volumes of content. Plus, they have carpenters who are aging out, and carpenters who are aging out, or tradespeople who are aging out, and retiring and can no longer use tools and be in the field. They have all of this knowledge that basically is just going to go poof when they leave. And they want, like, more than anything, they would want to share that information. And so my hope has always been with the venture folks, you all have the resources, you all have the tech and the ability to capture data. Why are we not focusing on capturing this information, celebrating, the disciplines, and then leveraging that knowledge for the future of all industries? There's no reason to silo this stuff off. There's no reason to keep these secrets. You talk to a lot of contractors who have secrets about how they build. They can't share it with anybody because, God forbid, if they did, that would destroy their business. Well, guess what? I know that everyone has their own unique abilities to, say, coping some crown, or I don't know, cutting a roof. And I know that stuff can get very technical, and it's understandable, but why keep it a secret? Why not share that? If you're afraid that someone's going to take your work away from you by sharing that knowledge that you built up over so long, that's understandable. We live in a highly competitive world, especially the industry of construction. It's very confrontational. It's very competitive. We need to flip that, and regeneration will guide us to flipping that to collaborating. And so, one of the things that I talk about a lot is collaboration. And people, especially throughout 2020, in this state of open-mindedness and thinking about resilience, are becoming much more open to being collaborative.
Hey everybody, this is Neil. We are going to get back to this great conversation in just 1 second. But I think it's fair to say that right now we are facing some pretty unprecedented challenges in the 21st century. I mean, you name it, environmentally, socially, economically, we've got some big problems that we need to overcome. And that's why, for me personally, and the people that work with us at Latitude, we want to dedicate our time and our energy so that we are not only working to put food on the table and a roof over our heads, but also make the world a better place. And so if you are at all interested in combining your sustainability values with a very powerful financial model of real estate, then I highly encourage you to check out what we are doing at Latitude. We are creating something truly special with a tribe of change agents that for now is working across North America, and hopefully one day in the future, with you coming on board, we can be working across the globe. So please check us out. You can go to www.chooselatitude.com, or you can find us on social media at latitude.realty on Instagram, and we are also on Facebook. Okay, let's get back into it. Let's actually talk about that, because one of the trends that I'm seeing emerge is that integrative and collaborative approach. And if you want to talk about regenerative design, one of the big hurdles that designers and developers will talk about is saying, hey, we first have to understand how to meet these principles of regeneration of how the construction project can get back to place. But we also have to figure out how the trades are going to come together And this system is going to talk with this system, or that tradesperson is going to talk with that tradesperson. And there just isn't that knowledge base there. So are you seeing more and more, are you seeing people that are open to sitting down to figure out some of these issues? Or do you find that it's still quite siloed off?
I think it's still quite siloed. We are seeing that people are open to the conversation and are actually curious. They recognize that especially with the shutdowns of projects, it forces people to think about, okay, what do we need to do differently within our business? And that certainly affects folks at the trades level who are just, making their 35 or 40 bucks an hour, at least here in the Bay Area. That's what most, journeymen are making. And that's the moment that's, if you get furloughed, especially if you're non-union, that really makes you question like your career and what you're going to do. Of course, you're a hustler. We're all hustlers, and we all find ways to put things together and find work. But you have to kind of step out of that feast or famine mentality to be able to have these thoughts. And it's not easy for folks to do that when they're struggling to put food on the table, which is the way it's been this year. Like March, people were really, really feeling it and leaving areas where they've been living for so long to go live somewhere that's cheaper. At least that happened a lot here in the Bay. But even looking into other kinds of careers, and that's an understandable natural reaction. But I think if you're able to step out and just have these conversations and think about how collaboration might, lead you to staying in the trades, but then also doing so in a way that's more resilient to these kinds of economic shocks, that's what we need more of. And it's happening a little bit, but we need it more. And so there are a couple, I think what my initial hope was with CIS, and at least what I felt was lacking, was that network and that platform for folks to get together and just talk and share those experiences. It's not something that people do when you're not on the work site. Like, you clock out at 4:00 and you're done. At least that's the way the mentality has been for so long. To think about overtime or to think about working on the weekends, not, for free, or at 6 or 8 o'clock at night when you can have these discussions, is not something that's really built into the mentality or into the culture. And that's something that we're working on. But there's a couple good platforms out there where folks are starting to get together and talk. It's not like regenerative talk necessarily, but just talking is progress, and being able to celebrate the work. And I think that the more we see of those kinds of applications and platforms, that it'll be much easier for us to like introduce topics or to introduce design challenges and all of these things that really get the wheels turning and that turn into initiatives and working groups and initiatives and then actual change.
I always think that you have to have those market shocks in order to catalyze innovation and collaboration. Because in the good times, whenever things are booming, I don't see a lot of construction firms that are saying, hey, let's iterate and let's listen. I see that coming much more out of it, and across the board. This isn't just for construction, but I see it across the board of saying, hey, we need to do something different because we have to figure out a way, or we need to pay attention to what people are wanting and tapping into that emergent process of, okay, how do we incorporate sustainability? I think that's something that is becoming in more of a mainstream lexicon, and people are starting to shift towards that. How do you think we go from convention to sustainable to regeneration? Like, that is a process that I'm curious. In the construction industry, what does that look like?
Man, that's such a great question. I think today, we need to skip sustainability, right? And we need to just jump over to regeneration, which I think can be easily framed with folks who aren't even maybe that familiar with sustainability, because here we are, 40 years after sustainability was like a thing, and it's still not really embraced in the industry. You know, the thing to do is to drive a huge truck with a very loud exhaust, and thinking about green building, while your architect may tell you to do that, and as a project manager or as a superintendent, you may understand that that's where the industry wants to go and has been wanting to go. Your clients, certainly the homeowners and the tenants, they certainly are asking for that. But when you're swinging a hammer, or just even an apprentice, unless your company or your mentors or your supervisors are really informed, you're not going to hear much about that. Because how does that relate to you not having to sweep a broom and get to actually install some shear wall, or whatever that next thing, install crown, whatever that next thing you're going after, and stay employed? I think that you can have that conversation when you talk about regeneration much easier than you can when you talk about sustainability, only because the green building, sustainable building space has been so focused on materials for so long that it's actually a little bit, it almost feels siloed from our humanness, at least in the construction space. That's sort of been my experience. There's a great organization out of the East Bay here called Build It Green. And Build It Green was started, I think, in the early 2000s, maybe late 90s. But they started they're an NGO, and their whole thing was teaching contractors how to use green building practices. And I knew folks who had taken those courses. I never took those courses, and I was somebody you would think would want to do that, but it seemed very far from what my goals were at the time, which was making more money, being able to do the bigger, better projects, having more access to leadership in a company. And so, I didn't really feel the relevance to the trades. And to my point about the young, 20-year-old who maybe just became a union carpenter, journeyman carpenter, and are they thinking about green building, and why would they be? To me, makes me think that the leap to regeneration is where we should be striving in the industry. And I think that there's just really thoughtful ways to do that.
It's interesting because I see it a little bit differently, that we can't have regeneration without sustainability. If we didn't have the little, this is funny, but from childhood, I had a sticker on my light switch that had a bug on top. Like whenever you turn the light switch on, the bug was like pushing down saying conserve energy whenever you're not in the room or something like that. And it's almost hard to go from, conventional world into how do we have positive externalities if we don't first think, hey, we are having a negative impact, so let's diminish that. And maybe it's the process that I had to come into of a regenerative mindset of how do we give back to people in place so that we can thrive, without first realizing, hey, we're causing some damage. We're doing it in a very extractive way. What do you think about that? I mean, and I really want to boil this down to construction. This is what I'm so curious about, is that part of the industry. And it is quite wasteful. If you look at the construction practice, and then they deliver a building that is also quite wasteful and extractive. And I don't even know how to how do you start to even say, let's do less bad?
Yeah. I love that framework that you're sharing there, because it never made sense to me. Let's do less bad. Like, why don't we just do good? Why are we doing less bad? And I recognize also that, so everything for me is really from that perspective of the young carpenter or the manager, or how they're going to keep their company afloat. which tends to be how we think in the construction industry. Everything is very self-centered, like how are we going to survive? These are the things that need to happen in order for us to survive. That's that feast or famine mentality, that we need to break those chains. And so for me, it's easy to just start with the individual. Do you like the feast or famine mentality? Is that fun for you? Is that good? And most people will be like, no, of course not. Well, what's the hardest thing for you as a business owner? Let's say, whether you're trucking the truck, you and some tools in a truck, or if you've got a couple, trades folk working with you, or you're a manager, or whatever, it's finding skilled labor. We talked about this earlier. That's the biggest issue, because it's a little bit of a catch-22. You need work, but you need people to do the work. All of a sudden the work comes, you don't have enough people, or vice versa, you got too many people, you got to let go of them. And so how do you have this conversation about sustainability, using better materials and better techniques with somebody who feels like that's a luxury? And maybe one way to spin it is say, you know what, let's forget about this conversation about using a more expensive material, or using a material that has a longer lead time, or let's think a little bit differently about the structure. And I know that this gets to be a little bit heady. Here's Carol Sanford's Regenerative Business, but there's some great stuff in that book. And I know you know Carol. I'd love to meet her one day. But my point is that if we start just with the individual and with their experiences and what they're struggling with, we can, I feel like, this is the theory, right? I'm doing it a little bit on my own, but to practice this, I haven't had enough time to be able to say, 6 out of 10 times, this is what happens. But when we are starting with the individual experience, we have the ability to go beyond green, sustainable, restorative, and all those steps that you see on that classic chart and continuum. I don't know. I don't know if we're disagreeing right now. I certainly would encourage disagreement, because then it would make the discussion certainly more fun. So I'm open to it. But I guess my point is, I think that focusing on sustainability is a challenge, because most folks in the trades see it as a luxury, something that they have to work to get to. And in order to get there, they need to somehow be more stable or something. And I'm just like, gosh, that sounds like that sounds like an unaccomplishable feat for most. What if we were to take some of that pressure off, take a little breath, and think like you did with our podcast? You said, let's just talk about you for a second. And so that's it gets a little bit fluffy for some folks, though. When you try and do that, they're like, what the heck is this person doing? Why do they, I don't know. I don't trust this person now. They're asking me some weird questions. And I mean, this is when I'm talking to tradespeople about these ideas, but so far that seems right to me.
Yeah, the education and development aspect, that is a regenerative principle, is to boil it down to that. And if you're going from a bottom-up approach, which I also think is a regenerative principle, to look at all the different ground level ways that we can then influence macro, or the micro influencing the macro, that's what you're talking about right now.
Yeah.
I've heard you talk about vertical integration, and I'm very curious on what you're seeing with trends with developers, how they are incorporating sustainability or regeneration or not. Where are we going as an industry moving forward? How do we see? What do you expect to see in the 2020 decade?
Awesome question. I'm based in Silicon Valley. And so I pay attention to the con-tech, prop tech startups that are getting seeded here and funded here. And I'm watching how some of the larger of those companies that are doing big construction on that level of, Halliburton and AECOM and Bechtel and all these large infrastructure companies that people know globally. And I'm seeing that there is at their core certain things that are just standards. And it has to do with a lot of modular prefab factory factory-based offsite building in order to speed up the process of the construction, of the work site of the build itself. And so also what I see with that momentum is somehow a statement that says the way to solve the housing crisis is to build quicker, to build cheaper. And the way that we do that is by reducing labor. And basically, what's the word? Idiot proofing, I think, is not the word that they would use, but idiot proofing the process. I think that there's some value in that because it's about being efficient and, it's about being able to scale. And so those are good things. And I don't know that folks in the regenerative space would discount those as important. But when you start out by saying, the problem is the labor, that is a flag to me. What I would like to see, and what I think I've seen a little bit, is trying to connect to the workforce and work with the workforce on safety programs and certain techniques to make those processes easier and better on the work site. But that's not. I don't feel a lot of positivity from that momentum that's moving there. There are developers who are getting more and more into what affordable housing is, and there's a lot of debates about what affordable housing is. Here in the Bay Area, a lot of folks would say that affordable housing is just a fancy way or a political way of getting more tech people into expensive living that is just more accessible to them, that meets some kind of millennial standard. And who knows, with COVID, there's supposedly some kind of exodus out of the Bay Area, and then there's not going to be as much of a focus on that, and we'll see. There are some good developers though that I've seen that really do care about place and human-centered design and integrated design, and I think that our best chance to accelerate that kind of work will be a ground-up strategy. And so far, the thing that I'm most excited about is some of the networks that are growing and the online courses that are sort of emerging for construction. Just in the past year, I've learned about a handful of really good universities that do online construction education training, as well as new tech platforms. I think that's the momentum, and that's the space where these ideas will be introduced easier. And that ground up, you really need that ground up approach in order to make something stick. I don't see it coming from the top because, first of all, venture-backed companies, it just doesn't. It's not in their formula to focus on these kinds of values at that level. Maybe at a later stage. You look at a company that's achieved that $1 billion valuation, and now they're like, okay, now we can have our educational, offering. What if we started with that? And what kind of funding would we need for that? It probably wouldn't be venture. That's okay. There's philanthropic funding, there's impact funding, there's supposedly regenerative funding. I think that's the ghost that everybody has been told is somewhere. But I feel very hopeful and feel very positive, and I feel that it has to be a multi-faceted, integrated approach to working with all of these verticals. When I spoke about vertical integration 6 months ago, or maybe a little bit before that, I was speaking about the value that you can, as a construction company, bring in-house different elements design, materials, and the full supply chain of the process to empower your organization to be more resilient. I still think that that's useful, but I also believe that it needs to start with the way that your organization is designed, not so much in the vertical of offerings, but just structurally your culture and how you care for the individuals within it. So I guess my perspective has gotten a little fluffier over the last year. Maybe that's an effect of COVID, or maybe it's just, seeing the light. I don't know what it is. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that the firms that are really going to jump forward are the ones that can see far enough outside of the short term and the medium term to the long term macro trends. And whether we like it or not, we are going to start experiencing on a daily level a change in a baseline. If we're both based out of the West Coast, but if every single summer we're going to start to see forest fires, there's going to be a real dot connection for people to realize, hey, something is going on that's quite different. And we need to do something about that. And the people that are figuring out, okay, this is how I can take my skill and my labor and my occupation and apply this kind of thinking towards it, no matter if it's construction, real estate, design, or any other profession. But like if they can start to incorporate that mentality, then we're going to start to see it. And the problem that I have with more vertical integration and bringing that into the development space is that I've seen it come out of a rise of the bottom line thinking. It's, hey, let's bring in the designer so that we can have that in house and we can put the margin on top of that. Let's bring in the construction because if we're paying a 25% margin to the contractor, then we can have that on our books. Or hey, let's do that with property management. Let's bring that in house because it makes a whole lot of sense, especially if we're doing specialized systems. They need to know how to do it, but that's 10% that we'd be paying another firm. And so that modality of thinking, I think, pushes vertical integration into the profit motive space, and it diminishes the beauty of what an ecosystem thinking is, of the plurality of the skills and the talents that can emerge, and you can see how they all fit together. And that's what's so cool about collaboration, is if we can all get in a room together, from hey, we're thinking about this kind of project, to how are we going to finance it, to how are we going to build it, to how are we going to design it, then how are we going to manage it on the back end, then wow, so much more comes out of it than just, hey, we could shave off a margin of 25 to 30% if we brought that in house and we just pumped out the same modular whatever. And I'm not picking on modular. I think that it's a blessing and a curse all at the same time.
Right. Yeah. Well, I love the collaborative approach, even when it pushes my own sort of where I'm at, in my philosophies. And I very much agree with you though about how that reasoning for vertical integration, at least the way we've seen it come up in the last 5 years in the industry. So I think that there's an opportunity to do that, have that collaboration between real estate, the designers, meaning the sales folks, the brokers, all the way down to the maintenance, the maintenance technicians. What does that collaboration look like? I think it would be a beautiful ecosystem to support, and we need more of it, man. There's no question.
You mentioned something, and I this can be our final wrap-up thing, but this is going to be the $1 million question. Is you said the ghost of regenerative finance?
Yes.
Let's talk about that. Are you seeing a lack of interest in this area, a lack of financial interest?
There have been two, well, maybe three, but there's been a couple things that have happened to me personally this year where I was like, this is a ghost, at least right now. I'll break it down in a bit of a chronology. One, I've always been told, at least being introduced into the world of regeneration, and I'm a part of a bunch of networks and we share some of them. Global Regeneration Collab is one, but there's a handful of others out there that are great, where people come together and talk about their projects. And everyone has always said, look, there's all this money, we just need to get access to it. 67 trillion, 30 trillion, 48 trillion, like the numbers are thrown around, but it's a lot of money. And so what a lot of folks, what I have been noticing though, is when you've got these beautifully designed regenerative projects at scale, and they have impact on entire countries, because that's what a lot of the projects that I've seen and are working on, are attempting to do. There's the phases, there's the project preparation phase and the pre-design phase, and then, pilot and prototype and pilot and all this stuff. And you need to raise money for each of these. And so at the earliest phases, there has been this approach, like maybe early on we can get some philanthropic funding. Oh, I know a regenerative investor, but their risk profile is a little bit different than this one project. So you kind of gotta navigate this world, which is awesome learning experience for me, and I'm really enjoying learning about it all. But I keep running into the same roadblocks that most people do. I had this really awesome though experience where we thought that one of our projects was appropriate for a grant. I think the grant was going to be for like $150,000 for a project that we have in India. And the title of the grant was design. So we feel like, oh, great, we're at the pre-design phase where we've got a bunch of initial data gathered. We should be able to get this. It's a really exciting project. When we applied, when we had the conversation and the interview with the the investors, they're like, you know what, you guys are really at the project preparation phase. And we're like, okay, well, why don't you define that for us? What is that about? And they said, well, we're really looking for a project that is ready for financial modeling design. And what that made me think, or led me to think, is that the supposed regenerative financiers that are out there have not yet figured out what regenerative finance is, because they're willing to pay people to figure out what the financial models are. And so that was just a moment where I was just like, okay, we still got a way to go. I think the approach to blended capital, where you bring a bunch of interests together and say, okay, your money's going to go to this and your money's going to go to this. And you have certain mandates for solar, and you have mandates for workforce development, and you have mandates for X, Y, and Z. That blended approach is there. But so far, it's just not that. That's why I believe it's a ghost, is that because it just seems that no one's quite figured it out. There's been a lot of papers written about the different traditional sort of existing financial architecture that exists that can somewhat be blended together, but a lot of this is theory. And we don't have a lot of precedents or case studies where these approaches worked to fund a regenerative project. But I would love to learn either from you or from others, Adam, actually, you're wrong, and there is a flow of this, and these are the regenerative projects that have happened and scaled. I'm sure they exist. I just haven't come across them myself.
With our work in real estate, it all comes down to the financing. That's typically the biggest impediment. It's not necessarily the designers or the construction side, but it's how do you actually get things funded? And the whole funding cycle is kind of bananas. The longest term commercial financing that you're going to get is 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. So most developers, whenever they're conceiving a project, they're looking at how do we build it and sell it, or how do we build it and manage it and hold it for 10 years, and then we're going to sell it. And there's all kinds of tax incentives to say, hey, this is the life cycle, this 10-year span or less. Your construction financing, higher interest rate, but much shorter term. And that's really the big disconnect I see. Like most people, when you talk about regeneration, they can't even conceive of you're talking outside of agriculture. It's like Regenerative agriculture is regeneration. And if you try to bring that into real estate or construction, God forbid, they're like, wait a second, we're not talking about the same thing here. It's like, no, we are talking about the same thing because we're talking about principles and frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want to bring it into banking, if we're looking outside of that very short-term, narrow focus of what's the short-term return going to be to, hey, what's the long-term return going to be? What's the multi-pronged return going to be?
Yeah.
Then it's like you're playing a completely different game. That's not just what's the IRR on the project and what's the debt coverage ratio going to be. But part of me that also feels a little bit battered down by the financing side is saying, we just have to make these projects fit the current banking paradigm, that like the money is out there, but we don't have to sell it as this like specialty regenerative thing. It just has to fit the banker's code. It's almost why I continue to want to be in the transactional space of real estate and apply regenerative thinking, because I know, hey, this is something that people are starting to tune into. They want to care about materials and health and well-being, sustainability, community, ecology. Like they have a desire for this, and the funding mechanism is there. And that's almost what I hear green builders are talking about. They're like, man, we've got a lot going on. How do we stay true to the course that we're on? And it's like, hey, I think you stay true to the course that you're on because the demographics and the taste and preferences are starting to change. And it's taken a long time. So I really applaud all the builders that are out there that have just like stuck with it and said, this is how we're going to advance the field. And we couldn't be here without them. So I don't think that there's a solution in there, but certainly my take on.
I love that you said that though, about regeneration and agriculture is like what regeneration is. You don't see conversations about real estate and construction. And I think that that's the beauty of how the regenerative principles that we talk about today are beginning to evolve. The point that I think is sticking with me here that you just made is it's hard to finance a regenerative restoration project for like a wetland. It's not hard to fund a housing project. It's not hard to fund a real estate project. If we just bring those principles into those spaces, we actually could perhaps jumpstart more regenerative financing. And so, I really, commend the work that you're doing, applaud the work that you're doing. When I first saw what you were doing as a regenerative real estate broker or thought leader, really, no one's doing that. And similarly in the construction space, even I've spoken to Joel at Regenesis about this, who had a construction company. And he told me about the work that they did. It's still very nascent. Like this regenerative construction thing, no one knows what it is. People have done it. And again, Joel and Bill Reed are certainly leaders in this space, among others. But I guess the point is, you talk about the 99.9 repeating percent of the industry, regenerative construction is new. And we get to be the folks that help continue to make it grow. And I think there's a lot of possibility. Just introducing housing or real estate onto a regenerative project all of a sudden gives you access to a whole bunch of different kind of financing. Now, those developers and investors may not want to invest in, some of the soil amending aspects of the project, but that's what blended finance is for. So I think there's a collaborative effort that is emerging more and more.
Yeah, well, Adam, I appreciate you taking the time to come out, and it's been a meandering conversation, and I think that's really good because this is such an emerging thing, and I think you and I are both at a point where we're standing on the shoulders of the giants that came before us that really are probably worn out they're tired of like, man, I wish people just got it.
Yeah.
But I will say, and this is to the listeners out there, that like, if you want to start incorporating these things, like start really tuning in and figuring out what this means, because we're at the same point of like, how does this come together? How do you adopt a regenerative mindset and not just here's the playbook for you? Because we need other people. We need change agents. And as Jason McLennan of the Living Future Institute said, being a change agent isn't easy. This is a hard line of work. But I can personally tell you, once you start to align your values with your business, with your life, it really creates so much energy and momentum there. And I really applaud the work that you're doing with the center. And I hope that we get a chance to work together, because what you're talking about is a very revolutionary, different approach to construction and the trades. And I think it'd be awesome to see more regenerative construction come out of this conversation.
Yeah, well, I can't thank you enough. This has been great. I was looking very much forward to doing this with you, especially on the last day of 2020.
Okay, everybody, that is a wrap. This is another just great episode that I'm so glad that you're able to tune in. And thank you for being interested in regenerative real estate. What we are trying to do is help people and planet thrive together by using the built environment as a catalyst. And so I've got a couple big asks for you. Number one is, can you please go to wherever you're listening to this podcast, leave us a rating and review. Those actually go so far. And since this is such a passion project for us, we really want to be able to attract the best thought leaders from around the world. Second is that if you really like the content that we're putting out, you can find us on our own Medium publication called Regenerative Real Estate. We also have a very active community on Facebook, which is called Regenerative Real Estate and Design, which you can request to be a part of, and we would love to have you. And third, this goes to what we do every single day, helping buyers and sellers demystify sustainability by working with people that want to either buy a property and are trying to figure out the financing of, how do I actually live out my values? How do I put that water catchment system on there? Or how do I go finance a solar panel PV array? Or maybe I want to live closer to nature. And what are the properties that are out there that I can do that? And so we represent buyers like that. We also happen to represent sellers that maybe they've already invested in sustainable features. Maybe they have a living building or a LEED certified project. We want to help tell that story. So much of what goes on in the real estate industry is transactional thinking at best, and it translates down into agents just really don't know anything about sustainability. And for us, we think that the value is there, and we want to help highlight really the intrinsic value of it, not just the bedrooms and the baths and the square feet of what typical marketing goes on. So if you know of anybody that wants to buy or sell these kinds of properties that we're talking about, please reach out to us at Latitude, and be sure to subscribe for another great episode coming up next week.